Hey Upper East Siders and my lovely glow-getters. Welcome back to my channel. Day 5 of Sean Diddy Combs' federal trial, Cassie Ventura's final testimony, and new witnesses. Today was Cassie Ventura's final day on the witness stand in Sean Puff Diddy Combs' federal sex trafficking trial. The courtroom saw the end of Cassie's grueling cross-examination and a brief redirect by prosecutors, followed by new witnesses taking the stand with corroborating evidence. It was an emotional day, filled with detailed text messages and emails, accounts of physical abuse, and even an on-stand breakdown by Cassie. The proceedings also featured testimony from a Homeland Security special agent who presented photos of items seized from Combs, from bottles of baby oil to stashes of cash, and from singer Dawn Richard, who described a 2009 assault by Combs. Below is a comprehensive recap and translation of the full Day 5 transcript, capturing the legal and emotional nuances, the courtroom exchanges, including jury reactions, and post-court statements by Cassie and her husband, Alex Fine. Cassie Ventura's final day on the stand. Cassie Ventura, the prosecution's star witness, returned to the stand for the fourth and final day of her testimony, visibly pregnant and determined. Defense attorney Ana Esteval resumed her cross-examination, continuing to sift through years' worth of Cassie's communications and past actions. The defense's strategy was to portray Cassie as a willing participant in Combs' wild sexual lifestyle and to undermine her credibility. Esteval gently questioned Cassie, at times almost conversationally, highlighting friendly or suggestive exchanges between Cassie and Combs. The tone was surprisingly calm, more like two acquaintances chatting than a combative grilling, but the intent was clear. Esteval presented dozens of text messages and emails spanning Cassie and Combs' decade-long on-and-off relationship, attempting to show that while the relationship might have been toxic, it was mutual and not outright criminal. One focus of the cross-exam was Cassie's own words in these messages. At Esteval's prompting, Cassie was even made to read aloud explicit text messages she had sent to Combs during their relationship. Some of these messages showed Cassie seemingly enthusiastic about the very freak-off sex sessions she later described as traumatic. For instance, in an August 2009 exchange, Combs asked when Cassie wanted their next group sexual encounter, and Cassie replied, "I'm always ready to freak off." 2 days later, she sent him an explicit follow-up message about her desires, to which he replied with eager anticipation. Cassie responded, "Me too, I just want it to be uncontrollable." In another text from July 2013, Cassie wrote, "Wish we could have FO'd before you left," using FO as shorthand for freak off. And in 2017, she texted, "I love our FOs when we both want it." These messages, read in open court, seem to contradict Cassie's testimony that she hated the freak-off orgies. The jurors leaned forward in their seats as the explicit messages were displayed on monitors in the jury box. One female juror shook her head in disbelief at a particularly graphic line, while another male juror pressed his thumb to his chin, staring intently at the screen. Several jurors glanced at Cassie or took notes, their faces registering a mix of shock and curiosity. Cassie remained mostly composed during this ordeal. As a 38-year-old in her third trimester of pregnancy, she had held up remarkably well through days of testimony. While she had cried on earlier days, especially when describing violent incidents and humiliating freak-offs, today she largely answered in a steady, matter-of-fact tone. The defense's gentle approach perhaps helped keep the atmosphere calm, but it was clearly aimed at lulling the jury into seeing Cassie as cooperative in the past. Meanwhile, Combs sat at the defense table, appearing relaxed, even leaning back with his legs crossed as these messages were read. At one point during a pause, Combs casually turned to observe the gallery and even greeted some reporters with a "How you doing?" projecting confidence. His family members were in court earlier in the week, but notably his young twin daughters were absent during the explicit testimony on Thursday and Friday. Despite the composed veneer, Cassie did push back on the defense's narrative. She often tried to provide context beyond the cherry-picked messages. At one point, frustrated that only select texts were shown, Cassie interjected that there's a lot we skipped over. She wanted the jury to know that those explicit lines were not the whole story. When asked about a 2017 message where she said she loved the freak-offs, Cassie firmly explained that loving FOs were just words at that point. She testified that by then she was merely saying what Combs wanted to hear. She never truly enjoyed those sessions, but felt compelled to act like she did. In fact, Cassie told the jury that she often felt pressured or coerced to participate in these drug-fueled orgies to keep Combs happy and avoid his anger. For example, she revealed that before one freak-off in 2016 at a Los Angeles hotel, the same night that ended with Combs viciously assaulting her in a hallway, she sent him enthusiastic sexual texts only because she wanted to get the encounter over with and prevent him from causing a public scene ahead of a movie premiere she was set to attend. This context cast her seemingly eager messages in a very different light. They were acts of survival and appeasement, not genuine desire. The defense also brought up instances of Cassie's jealousy and anger during the relationship, implying that some conflicts were ordinary lovers' quarrels rather than abuse. Cassie acknowledged feeling hurt by Combs' attention to other women and the double standards in their relationship. He didn't want me seeing anyone else, but he felt free to do what he wanted, she noted. She testified that after a few years with Combs, she longed to be a bigger part of his life, but he wouldn't let me in. Their on and off relationship spanned from 2007 to 2018. And throughout that time, Cassie said, Combs maintained control and kept her at arm's length emotionally. Freak-offs versus a swinger's lifestyle. In a telling exchange, Ana Estevao tried to normalize Combs' demanded orgies by comparing them to a consensual swinger's lifestyle. Estevao asked Cassie whether she thought the freak-offs might simply have been part of a swinger dynamic that both partners indulged in. Cassie gave a nuanced answer. In a sexual way, she said, they might appear similar. After all, both involve group sex. But she quickly added, they're very different. Cassie elaborated that what Combs put her through was not a typical open relationship or swinging scenario. The freak-offs took place in private, often in dark hotel rooms, orchestrated entirely by Combs, who was controlling the whole situation, she explained. This was not like a consensual swingers party where all parties have equal agency. Rather, it was something he compelled her to do for his own gratification, under threat of violence. Earlier in the week, Cassie had testified that Combs was obsessed with this kind of voyeuristic control. She even disclosed that the ordeals took such a physical toll that she sometimes needed IV fluids to recover afterwards, and that she developed an opioid addiction just to feel numb after these traumatic encounters. Those details underscored just how far removed Combs' freak-offs were from any healthy sexual lifestyle. Throughout the cross-examination, the defense's overarching aim became evident: to cast doubt on Cassie's narrative of abuse. Estevao subtly suggested that Cassie's memories might be exaggerated or influenced by therapy, and that her motives in testifying could be financial. The lawyer noted that Cassie only came forward legally in late 2023, years after the relationship ended, insinuating this was driven by money or revenge. Estevao brought up that Cassie had entered into specialized trauma therapy after leaving Combs, including treatments like neurofeedback and EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which can aid trauma survivors in processing and recalling painful memories. The implication was that such therapies might make Cassie misremember or reinterpret events. Cassie acknowledged undergoing trauma therapy. She didn't go into great detail, except to defend its value. I don't want to talk too much about it, she said of her treatment, but if you are beat up and can't walk out of the room, therapy, helps you walk out of the room. In other words, therapy helped her reclaim her life. Far from implanting false memories, Cassie implied, healing allowed her to finally confront and articulate the truth of what happened to her. Indeed, she later reflected in a statement that, the more I heal, the more I can remember, and the more I remember, the more I will never forget. Questions of money and motive. Toward the end of the cross-examination, Estevao raised the issue of money. The defense alluded to the fact that Cassie had received a large settlement payment from Combs just one day after filing a civil lawsuit against him in November 2023. It was revealed in court that Combs paid Cassie about $20 million to settle that civil case out of court. Estevao seemed to suggest that Cassie's accusations were financially motivated, noting that around the time she sued Combs, Cassie and her family had moved in with her parents, possibly implying she was financially strained. Cassie flatly rejected the notion that she did this for money. In a tearful exchange, she told the court that no amount of money could compensate for what she went through. If I never had to have freak-offs, I would have agency and autonomy, Cassie said on the stand. I wouldn't have had to work so hard to get it back. She testified that she would give back every dollar of that $20 million if it meant she never had to endure the years of abuse and freak-off. I would have my agency and autonomy, she said emphatically, indicating that her freedom and dignity mean more to her than any payout. This heartfelt declaration left a strong impression in the courtroom. Even Combs's own expression, which had been calm, seemed to turn more serious as Cassie spoke those words. Several jurors looked moved. A few glanced at Combs to gauge his reaction, while others fixed their eyes on Cassie as she wiped away tears. Before Cassie stepped down, the defense slipped in one more notable point, another settlement Cassie stood to gain. They questioned her about an expected roughly $10 million settlement from Intercontinental Hotels. Cassie explained that this was related to a 2016 incident at the Intercontinental in Los Angeles. The infamous night caught on security camera when Combs beat her in a hotel hallway, kicking and dragging her on the floor. That disturbing video had been played at length in court earlier in the week, one of the trial's most damning pieces of evidence. Cassie had sued the hotel chain for security failures, and it was implied they were prepared to settle for about $10 million. By bringing this up, the defense implied Cassie had multiple financial incentives. But on redirect, prosecutors contextualized it differently. The fact that Cassie has another settlement stemming from Combs's violence only underlines the reality of the abuse. One jury member nodded slightly at hearing about the 2016 hallway attack, perhaps recalling that shocking video scene. Redirect examination and emotional conclusion. After nearly 2 full days of cross-examination, the defense finally wrapped up their questions by Friday afternoon. Prosecutor Emily Johnson then conducted a brief redirect of Cassie Ventura, aiming to repair any damage to Cassie's credibility and drive home the prosecution's narrative. Johnson's redirect was short and focused, a chance to clarify points that the defense had muddied. First, Johnson addressed the onslaught of text messages presented by the defense. She asked Cassie about the volume of messages exchanged over her 10-year relationship with Combs. Cassie affirmed that they had thousands upon thousands of texts, a vast history from which the defense cherry-picked a few dozen. This helped jurors understand that seeing a handful of flirty or sexual texts in isolation did not paint the full picture. Cassie was allowed to explain that for every explicit message the defense highlighted, there were many others where she expressed pain, fear, or attempts to assert herself that the jury did not see. As if to reinforce this, Johnson brought up one specific series of messages following the 2016 beating at the Intercontinental Hotel. Cassie read aloud a text she sent to Combs afterward. "I'm not a rag doll. I'm somebody's child." This poignant message, sent in the wake of being physically assaulted, showed Cassie standing up for herself and reminding Combs of her humanity. However, as Johnson noted, within days of that incident, Cassie and Combs were back to exchanging words of love. Cassie explained to the jury that this cycle, violent abuse followed by reconciliation, was typical of their relationship. It illustrated the trauma bond she had with Combs. He would hurt her, she would protest, but then out of fear or hope, she would be drawn back in with affection. This context helped rebut the defense's implication that loving texts meant everything was fine. Cassie's ragdoll text, especially, lingered in the courtroom air, a stark reminder of the abuse behind closed doors. Prosecutor Johnson also invited Cassie to reassert why she was testifying despite the personal toll. Cassie took a deep breath and addressed the courtroom, stating that coming forward was about justice and empowerment, not vengeance or money. She admitted the week had been extremely challenging for her, but also remarkably empowering and healing. Expressed hope that my testimony has given strength and a voice to other survivors, and that others who have suffered might find the courage to speak up and heal. Cassie's voice cracked with emotion as she spoke, and she had to dab her eyes. Some jurors appeared visibly moved, with one woman in the front row of the jury blinking away tears as Cassie testified to the cathartic effect of telling her story. Cassie added, "For me, the more I heal, the more I can remember, and the more I remember, the more I will never forget." It was a powerful statement, suggesting that her memories of the abuse have only grown clearer with time and healing, a direct rebuttal to any notion that her story was a recent fabrication. After everything she had described over 4 days, the beatings, the hundreds of freak-offs, the control and humiliation, Cassie made it clear she would not forget and could not be silenced. With that, Cassie Ventura's testimony concluded. As she stepped down from the stand, Cassie was overcome with emotion. She openly wept into a tissue, her shoulders shaking, before composing herself. Judge Aaron Subramanian called for a short recess to allow the witness to collect herself and to give jurors a breather after the intense testimony. As Cassie walked out of the courtroom, escorted by U.S. Marshals for security, many in the audience, including members of the press and public, broke into quiet applause or nods of respect, a show of support that the judge quickly silenced in accordance with court decorum. On the defense side, Combs looked on, expressionless, flanked by his attorneys. It was hard to gauge what impact Cassie's dramatic testimony had on him him or the jury, but there was a palpable sense in the room that a major chapter had closed. Cassie had spoken her truth under oath, and now the trial would move on to other evidence and witnesses. Special Agent Yasin Binda's evidence from Combs' hotel room. With Cassie's time on the stand over, the prosecution proceeded to call new witnesses to bolster their case. The first was Special Agent Yasin Binda, a Homeland Security Investigations HSI agent who participated in Combs' arrest in September 2024. Agent Binda works with HSI's human trafficking group, and her role in the trial was to connect Cassie's allegations to physical evidence. Taking the stand in her dark suit, Agent Binda testified about the search of Combs' New York hotel suite at the time of his arrest. She calmly described the layout of the luxurious suite and detailed what investigators found hidden within it. Her testimony was accompanied by photographs projected on the courtroom screens. These were evidence photos released by the government, giving the jury a visual tour of Combs' private space. Agent Binda told the court that inside a hallway closet, agents discovered 2 duffel bags tucked away. One bag was filled with numerous bottles of baby oil, and the other contained assorted sexual lubricants. In the bathroom, they found several more bottles of baby oil lining the shelves. At this, a few jurors exchanged looks. The connection to Cassie's testimony was obvious. She had said that during the freak-offs, Combs insisted everyone slather themselves in baby oil to the point that it became a notorious requirement. Next, Agent Binda testified agents found a small zippered pouch in a drawer. Inside it was a prescription pill bottle labeled to a Frank Black, an alias investigators believe Combs used. However, instead of pills, the bottle contained 2 packets of pink powder. Lab tests later identified one packet as ketamine, an anesthetic often misused as a party drug, and the other as a mixture of ketamine and MDMA ecstasy. This corroborated Cassie's claims that Combs plied her with drugs. She had mentioned in prior testimony that he often made her take something to loosen up during the freak-offs, and ketamine was specifically referenced. Agent Binda's team also seized around $9,000 in cash from the suite. The money was found bundled in a bedside drawer. Prosecutors implied this could be payment for the male sex workers involved in the sessions, or simply cash Combs kept handy. Either way, it fit the prosecution narrative of Combs running a trafficking enterprise with ready cash for illegal transactions. Additionally, Binda mentioned they recovered a small quantity of white powder, cocaine, and some prescription medications belonging to Combs, but the main emphasis was on the baby oil, lubricant, and ketamine, items directly echoing Cassie's story of drug-fueled, oil-slicked orgies. As photos of these items flashed on the screen, dozens of baby oil bottles piled in evidence bags, the pink powder packets next to the prescription vial, and neat stacks of $100 bills, the jury members appeared riveted. One juror raised his eyebrows seeing the baby oil stash. Another pursed her lips at the sight of the drugs. These tangible items gave corroborative weight to Cassie's testimony. What might have sounded unbelievable to some, the idea of ritualistic freak-off kits, was made very real by Agent Binda's matter-of-fact inventory. In fact, one juror glanced over at Combs with an expression of astonishment, as if to silently ask, "Why on earth would a man need so much baby oil?" The defense on cross-examination of Agent Binda had limited options. Combs's attorneys asked a few perfunctory questions, confirming that items like baby oil are not illegal to possess. They hinted that Combs could have legitimate uses for cash or personal reasons for having those drugs. For example, claiming ketamine was for consensual use at parties, not to drug anyone against their will. But this line of defense was weak. In a notably awkward moment, defense lawyer Mark Agnifilo quipped, "Some people just have dry skin," when referencing the trove of baby oil, trying to elicit a chuckle. It fell flat. No one in the courtroom seemed to buy that innocent explanation, especially since multiple witnesses had now testified about baby oil being a staple of Combs's sex parties. The prosecution let the evidence speak largely for itself, confident that Binda's testimony had further solidified Cassie's account with physical proof. Dawn Richards' testimony, witnessing a 2009 assault. The final witness of the day was Dawn Richard, a singer and former member of the girl group Danity Kane, a group that was actually formed on Diddy's reality show, Making the Band. Dawn Richard had her own history with Combs professionally, but now she was appearing as a witness for the prosecution. Notably, Dawn filed a lawsuit against Combs last year, accusing him of physical physical abuse and of withholding money she was owed, indicating she, too, has allegations of mistreatment. Late in the afternoon, Dawn took the stand, dressed in a smart business casual outfit and visibly composed, yet resolute. She testified about an incident she witnessed in 2009 at Combs's mansion in Los Angeles during the time Cassie was his girlfriend. In powerful testimony, Dawn Richard recounted seeing Combs assault Cassie during a small gathering at the house. She vividly described the moment. Combs became enraged about something. Dawn wasn't sure what triggered it, and he lunged at Cassie. He was trying to hit her, Dawn said. Cassie, who was caught off guard, fell to the floor. She fell down, Dawn testified. She was in the fetal position. Lying curled up, Cassie was covering her head as Combs stood over her in a fury. Dawn's voice trembled slightly as she relived the scene. The courtroom was pin-drop silent. Even Combs lowered his gaze. Dawn continued. Immediately after this outburst, Combs seemed to collect himself and noticed Dawn standing there, shocked at what she had just seen. Dawn recalled that Combs pulled her aside privately. With a chilling calmness, he attempted to reframe the violence she'd witnessed. He told me that what I saw was passion, Dawn testified, rolling her eyes at the absurdity of that word. Combs then issued a veiled threat to ensure her silence. According to Dawn, he said that where he's from, people go missing if they talk about things like this. The implication was clear. If Dawn ever breathed a word of what she saw, she could be in danger. Gasps could be heard from a few people in the courtroom when Dawn repeated those words. In the jury box, one juror's mouth fell open in astonishment at the brazenness of the threat, while another juror visibly grimaced. Dawn Richards' testimony was brief but corroborated key elements of Cassie's account. It established that Combs was physically violent with Cassie in front of third parties, not just behind closed doors, and that he used intimidation to cover it up. Dawn also alluded to the fact that this wasn't the only time. She said she saw him attack Cassie on multiple occasions, suggesting a pattern of abuse that other industry people were aware of. She even mentioned that other celebrities, like R&B singer Usher, were present during at least one violent episode in 2010, though details on that would come later, possibly in her continued testimony the following week. By bringing Dawn to the stand, prosecutors gave the jury an independent eyewitness who had nothing to gain by lying. In fact, Dawn risked her career to speak up. Her account lent tremendous credibility to Cassie's story. It was no longer just Cassie's word versus Diddy's, but also the word of a former Bad Boy Records artist who saw the abuse firsthand. During a quick cross-examination, the defense tried to chip away at Dawn's testimony. Combs's lawyer pressed her on why she didn't report the 2009 incident at the time and why she only filed a lawsuit years later. Dawn responded calmly that she was scared back then. "You heard what he told me," she said, referring to the missing people threat. "I was terrified. We all were." She also mentioned the power dynamics at play. Combs was not only her boss, in a sense, as the head of her music label, but also one of the most powerful men in the industry. Reporting him felt impossible at the time. As for her recent lawsuit, Dawn stated she could no longer stay silent after hearing about others coming forward. The defense also insinuated that Dawn might have bitterness over money disputes, since she claimed Combs withheld her earnings, to which she shot back, "I'm here because of what I saw, not because of money." Her resolve on the stand was evident. It was clear by this point that the prosecution's case was weaving together a narrative of systematic abuse and intimidation. Cassie's own testimony, backed by physical evidence, the photos and items Agent Binda presented, and now backed by another victim's eyewitness testimony from Dawn Richard. Meanwhile, the defense's strategy was also apparent. They aimed to isolate each incident as either consensual or not as bad as portrayed, and to question witnesses' motives, implying they are after money or fame. But as day 5 ended, the momentum felt like it was with the prosecution. Cassie's compelling testimony, combined with Agent Binda's evidence and Dawn's corroboration, had created a formidable tapestry of evidence for the jury to consider. Courtroom reactions and atmosphere. Day 5's proceedings took a visible emotional toll on everyone in the courtroom. The jury's reactions ranged from shock and empathy to analytical focus. When explicit sexual content was discussed, like Cassie's texts about freak-offs, some jurors looked uncomfortable or disturbed. One juror's face flushed red as raunchy language was read. During Cassie's most emotional moments, for example, when she cried describing how she'd trade millions to have her autonomy back, several jurors appeared dared move. A middle-aged female juror dabbed at her eyes with a tissue discreetly. A young male juror kept his gaze down, fidgeting with a pen, perhaps to distance himself from the raw emotion. The jurors leaned in when evidence photos were shown, paying close attention to Agent Binda's testimony. By contrast, during the defense's cross-exam, when Cassie was reading her explicit texts, a couple of jurors glanced occasionally at the defense table with what looked like skepticism, as if questioning the relevance of this exercise. At one point, a juror did submit a question via the judge, a practice allowed at the judge's discretion. The juror's question, which Judge Subramanian read out, asked Cassie to clarify the timeline of her therapy and when certain memories returned to her. Cassie answered that she started intensive trauma therapy in 2019 and that some specific memories, like details of a particular violent incident, became clearer over the last couple of years as she worked with her therapist. This exchange highlighted that the jury was actively processing the information and honing in on the crux of the defense's insinuations about memory. It also gave Cassie a chance to reaffirm that therapy helped her recover memories, not invent them. The spectators' gallery was packed on this day, filled with journalists, advocacy group observers, and supporters from both sides. Combs's entourage and family members were less present today, likely because Cassie's graphic testimony was concluding, but Cassie's supporters, including her mother and close friends, were there daily, often seen praying or squeezing one another's hands during difficult testimony. Cassie's husband, Alex Fine, was a constant presence in the front row of the public seating, often accompanied by Cassie's mother. Observers noted Alex's demeanor. He watched his wife testify with a mix of concern and admiration, often clenching his jaw during descriptions of abuse and even shedding a few tears when Cassie broke down on the stand. During one recess, as Cassie stepped off the stand, she and Alex briefly locked eyes. He placed a hand over his heart and nodded to her, a small gesture of solidarity that did not go unnoticed by those nearby. The courtroom atmosphere on this fifth day was intense, but also had a sense of resolution, the culmination of Cassie's courageous testimony. Court officers had to remind the audience more than once to maintain order, particularly after Cassie's dramatic exit when soft applause and murmurs rippled through the room. Outside the courthouse, the media circus continued. A large crowd of reporters and onlookers had gathered, given it was a Friday, and Cassie's testimony was expected to wrap up. Security was tight, as always. Combs was escorted out in handcuffs at day's end. He has been held in custody throughout the trial, and he kept his head down as a throng of cameras flashed. Cassie, on the other hand, emerged to an outpouring of support. Aftermath. Cassie and Alex Fine's statements to the press. With the week's testimony concluded, Cassie Ventura and her husband, Alex Fine, released public statements reflecting on the trial so far. Cassie's attorney, Douglas Wigdor, stepped outside the courthouse flanked by Cassie and Alex. Cassie did not speak directly, likely on advice not to address press questions mid-trial. Wigdor read a prepared statement in Cassie's voice to the assembled press. In it, Cassie said that testifying had been extremely challenging, but also remarkably empowering and healing for her. She conveyed how important it was for her to speak her truth and hoped that her 4 days on the stand has given strength and a voice to other survivors of abuse. Cassie thanked her family and advocates for their unwavering support and acknowledged the kindness of many who had reached out during the trial. She made a particular note that, "For me, the more I heal, the more I can remember, and the more I will never forget." Those words underscored that she stands by everything she testified. If anything, she could probably tell even more given the time. Cassie's statement concluded with her expressing relief at putting this chapter behind her. "I'm glad to put this chapter of my life to rest," she said, adding that as she now turns to focus on the final weeks of her pregnancy, she is asking for privacy for herself and her growing family. She said she looks forward to welcoming her baby and raising her children in a world that is now safer because of this process. It was a poignant moment, Cassie essentially declaring that whatever the outcome of the trial, speaking out has liberated her from the shadows of her past. Next, a statement from Alex Fine Cassie's husband was read. Alex's words were filled with love, fury, and admiration. "Over the past 5 days, the world has gotten to witness the strength and bravery of my wife freeing herself of her past," Alex said in the statement. He addressed the speculation about how he felt listening to Cassie recount such intimate and horrific experiences. "I have felt so many things sitting there," he shared. "I have felt tremendous pride and overwhelming love for Cass. Hearing what Cassie endured had also filled him with profound anger that she has been subjected to sitting in front of a person who tried to break her, he said. At this, Cassie, standing beside him, squeezed his hand and looked at him with tears in her eyes. Alex's statement then spoke directly to Combs and those who enabled him over the years. Please know this. You did not. You did not break her spirit nor her smile that lights up every room, he declared firmly. You did not break the mother who gives the best hugs and plays the silliest games with our little girls. You did not break the woman who has made me a better man. Alex wanted the world to understand that Cassie emerged unbroken and victorious in life, despite Combs's efforts to destroy her. In a particularly striking line, Alex refuted the notion that anyone saved Cassie except herself. I did not save Cassie, as some have said, he noted. To say that is an insult to the years of painful work my wife has done to save herself. Cassie saved Cassie. This sentiment resonated strongly. Even Cassie nodded and mouthed thank you to him as those words were read. Alex ended by saying their life now is surrounded by love, laughter, and our family. That this horrific chapter is forever put behind us, and that they will not be making additional public comments on it. He requested the media to respect their privacy as they prepare to welcome their baby boy into a world that is now safer because of his mom. These statements from Cassie and Alex marked an emotional capstone to the week. They demonstrated a united front and emphasized the personal triumph and closure that Cassie's testimony represented for their family. On the courthouse steps, as the statements were read, there was a quiet hush among the crowd of reporters, and even a few of the hardened journalists seemed touched. Once the statements concluded, the couple, arm in arm, were quickly guided to a waiting vehicle amid shouted questions from the press, which they did not answer. One could sense a mix of exhaustion and relief emanating from Cassie as she left. She had done what she came to do, narrator's observations and analysis. From my seat in the courtroom throughout day 5, I observed a trial that had reached a dramatic turning point. Cassie Ventura's testimony was nothing short of groundbreaking in this case. She came across as credible, steadfast, and deeply sympathetic. The defense's attempts to portray her as a gold digger or a consensual participant largely fell flat in the face of her detailed, heartfelt account and the evidence backing it. In fact, some of the defense's chosen tactics, like reading the explicit texts, may have backfired. While they intended to show Cassie's enthusiasm, those same messages, juxtaposed with her explanation and visible pain, likely reinforced to jurors how complex and coercive the situation was. The juror who shook her head at the vulgar texts, for example, didn't seem to be blaming Cassie. If anything, she looked disgusted by the whole scenario that Cassie had been placed in. Cassie's honesty about once saying she loved the freak-offs, followed by her clarification that it was just appeasing talk, probably rang true to anyone familiar with abusive relationships. It is common for survivors to placate their abusers. The cycle of abuse was on full display: love bombing, violence, reconciliation. Cassie illustrated it expertly, even through the medium of text messages. The introduction of physical evidence by Agent Binda was a critical bolster to the prosecution. The phrase baby oil had been coming up repeatedly during Cassie's testimony, almost to a surreal degree. Seeing those literal bottles of baby oil that the feds found in Combs's closet was a moment where the courtroom collectively raised its eyebrows. It was a jarring confirmation that what Cassie described was not exaggerated. Similarly, the drugs and cash found tied the narrative into the broader charges of sex trafficking and racketeering. It painted a picture of Combs's hotel room as a headquarters for illicit activities, almost like the stash of a man running a sex ring, which is essentially what the government alleges, a criminal enterprise built around sex and exploitation. The defense could do little to counter hard evidence like that. No witty explanation can fully discount a closet full of lube and a bottle of ketamine. Dawn, Richard's testimony, added yet another layer of corroboration. Having a third-party witness, and a relatively famous one at that, recount a similar pattern of violence and intimidation was likely very impactful. It's one thing to hear Cassie say he beat me and threatened me, and another to have Dawn say, I saw him beat her and he threatened me to stay quiet. Dawn's account also subtly suggested that many in Combs' circle knew about his behavior, but stayed silent out of fear, a dynamic not uncommon when powerful men abuse their power. This may cause jurors to wonder how many others were too afraid to speak. It lends credence to the idea that Combs' alleged wrongdoing was long-running and widely suspected, not a new concoction by Cassie. From a legal strategy standpoint, by the end of day 5, the prosecution seemed to have achieved several goals. They humanized Cassie, reinforced her testimony with evidence and another witness, and preemptively answered the defense's key arguments, e.g., by allowing Cassie to explain the context of text and to deny financial motives. The defense, on the other hand, scored some points in highlighting Cassie's continued contact and professed love for Combs, even after incidents of abuse. Some jurors might indeed question why she stayed so long. However, domestic abuse dynamics are better understood now than in decades past. It's likely that at least some jurors recognize the pattern of an abused partner returning to their abuser due to manipulation, fear, or hope for change. Cassie's explanation that Combs held her psychologically and emotionally captive, not just physically, was compelling. There were also hints of the broader impact this trial is having. Outside the courtroom, protesters and supporters have been gathering. On this day, I noticed a small group of women holding signs that said, "We stand with Cassie," and "Survivors' voices matter." This trial, much like other high-profile Me Too era cases, is being closely watched as a bellwether for accountability in the music industry. Cassie's courage in testifying, especially being pregnant and under intense public scrutiny, has drawn admiration. Her statement about hoping to inspire other survivors suggests she's aware of that symbolic role. As the trial breaks for the weekend after day 5, the atmosphere feels momentarily lighter, at least for the prosecution's side. They have put on their star witness to great effect, and the case now shifts to additional witnesses. Expected next week are others like Cassie's mother, perhaps more law enforcement, and even celebrities like musician Kid Cudi, who reportedly will testify about an unrelated act of retaliation by Combs. The defense team, however, surely has taken note of the public sentiment and jury reactions. We might expect them to adjust their approach when presenting their own case. So far, they have been somewhat restrained with Cassie, likely because attacking an alleged victim too harshly can backfire with a jury. But they did manage to introduce elements of doubt about memory and motive, which they will likely hammer on with any expert witnesses or during closing arguments. In conclusion, day 5 was a milestone in this trial. Cassie Ventura left the courtroom with her head held high, having unburdened herself of years of secrets in excruciating detail. The evidence and testimonies heard today significantly buttressed the prosecution's claims that Sean "Diddy" Combs orchestrated and concealed a pattern of abuse. As an observer, I found the day to be a microcosm of the entire case. Raw, emotional testimony confronted by skeptical cross-examination, cold, hard evidence presented alongside personal stories, and underlying it all, the question of power dynamics and credibility. If the jurors believe Cassie and Dawn and the objective evidence, then Combs is in serious peril. If they find the defense's narrative of consensual kink and gold-digging plausible, then they may view the case very differently. Based on what I saw, Cassie's truth resonated. It had a ring of authenticity that is hard to fabricate. The jury's empathetic reactions to her and the disgust at some of the evidence suggest that at least on a human level, they were moved. The day ended with a sense of gravitas. Everyone knew we had witnessed something significant. As we head into the next week of the trial, the groundwork laid by Cassie's testimony will loom large over everything. The defense will have to carefully consider how to counter the impact of a witness who not only told a compelling story, but who was supported by evidence and another eyewitness. For now, the court is adjourned until Monday. One can only imagine the discussions jurors will have in the deliberation room when the time comes. About day 5, the day Cassie finished her testimony, and the day the curtain was truly pulled back on the alleged secret life of Sean "Diddy" Combs. Thank you once again for being part of my community, and I look forward to seeing you in our future videos. Until then, stay beautiful, stay natural, and stay you.